Let me introduce you to one of the most dangerous men. You have probably never heard of his name, is Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. But the world knows him as El Mencho. For years he sat at the top of the United States most wanted list with a bounty on his head that reached $15 million. That is more than what was offered for many terrorist leaders. What makes El Mencho fascinating is how different his story looks compared to drug lords who came before him. While El Chapo became a household name and even something of a twisted folk hero, El Mencho stayed in the shadows. He did not seek fame, he built something arguably more dangerous. His journey began humbly in the mountains of Michoacán, where he grew up poor, working in avocado fields like many young men from rural Mexico. He eventually migrated north, looking for opportunity. He ended up in California, but not through legitimate means. By the early 1990s, he was already involved in drug distribution. He was caught, convicted of heroin trafficking, and served nearly 3 years in prison before being deported back to Mexico. Most people would have walked away from that life. El Mencho went deeper. He became a police officer, which gave him knowledge of how law enforcement operated. Then he connected with established drug traffickers, learning the trade from the inside. When his mentor was killed in 2010, El Mencho seized the moment. He co-founded the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, and under his leadership, it grew into something Mexico had never seen before. What sets him apart is his willingness to use military-grade weapons and tactics. His cartel has shot down army helicopters with rocket launchers. They have used drones to drop explosives on enemies. This was not just a criminal organization, it was practically a parallel army. To understand the chaos that erupted across Mexico, you first need to understand how CJNG became so powerful in the first place. The cartel, known as Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, did not start as an empire. It started as something far more specific, a group of hired killers working for another organization, entirely back in the early 2000s. This group served as the armed wing of the Sinaloa cartel. They were the muscle, the enforcers, the ones sent in when someone needed to send a message. But when the Sinaloa cartel began to fracture, and its leadership faced pressure from both Mexican authorities and rival groups, something changed. A power vacuum opened up, and CJNG saw an opportunity. Under the leadership of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known throughout Mexico as El Mencho, the group did something remarkable. They did not just survive the chaos, they thrived in it. They broke away from their former masters and began building their own criminal empire, piece by piece, territory by territory. Their expansion strategy was brutal, but effective. They moved into areas where rival cartels had been weakened by government crackdowns or internal conflicts. Jalisco became their fortress. But they did not stop there. They pushed into neighboring states, then across Mexico, and eventually across borders. What made CJNG different was their business model. Yes, they trafficked cocaine and marijuana like everyone else. But they saw the future before anyone else did. They invested heavily in synthetic drugs, particularly fentanyl, which could be produced in labs without relying on foreign supply chains. This made them faster, more independent, and incredibly profitable. Today, the D reports that CJNG has a presence in all 50 U.S. states. They have become one of Mexico's most technologically advanced cartels, using drones, encrypted communications, and sophisticated money laundering networks. They evolved from hired guns into a multinational criminal corporation, and their reach now extends from the mountains of Jalisco to streets throughout North America. When people think of cartels, they often imagine gangs with guns hiding in the mountains, but CJNG has completely rewritten That playbook, what Mencho has built, is something closer to a private army than a criminal organization. Let us start with their military hardware. CJNG operates armored vehicles that they call monstruos, which means monsters in Spanish. These are essentially improvised tanks built from stolen trucks and heavy steel plating. Some can carry up to 20 armed fighters and are virtually bulletproof against standard police weapons. When one of these rolling fortresses rolls into a town, there is no question who is in charge. But the real game changer is their use of drones. CJNG has weaponized commercial drones by attaching explosives to them. They use these for both surveillance and attacks. Imagine being an enemy fighter and hearing that buzzing sound overhead, knowing it could drop a grenade on you at any moment. This is 21st century warfare happening on Mexican soil. What truly sets CJNG apart, though, is their approach to violence itself. For Mencho, brutality is not just a tool, it is theater. They film executions, torture sessions, and battles, then post them online. These videos serve multiple purposes. They terrify rivals, they attract young men who want to be part of something powerful, and they send a clear message to the government that CJNG cannot be ignored. This is psychological warfare at its most visceral. Traditional cartels tried to avoid attention. CJNG seeks it out. They want the world to know their name. Their propaganda machine is equally sophisticated. They have a dedicated media arm that produces slick recruitment videos showing heavily armed fighters in tactical gear, often with dramatic music and editing that would not look out of place in an action movie. For young men in impoverished communities with few opportunities, this imagery is powerful. The combination of military-grade equipment, theatrical violence, and professional propaganda has created something Mexico has never seen before: a cartel that operates more like an insurgent army than a criminal syndicate. To understand the war for Mexico, you have to look at a map, not a political map with borders and capitals, but a map of territory controlled by competing criminal organizations. And right now, that map is burning. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG, has transformed from a regional player into what many experts consider Mexico's most powerful criminal organization. Their heartland is Jalisco State, but their ambitions stretch far beyond those borders. When their leader El Mencho was killed by Mexican forces, the response was immediate and devastating. Within hours, cartel members launched coordinated attacks across 20 Mexican states. They burned businesses, blocked highways with torched vehicles, and turned city streets into battlegrounds. The violence hit hardest in the places that matter most to the cartels. Guadalajara, Mexico's second-largest city and a future World Cup host, saw panic at the airport as gunfire echoed from nearby highways. Tourists in Puerto Vallarta were told to shelter in place while black smoke rose from burning cars in Guanajuato State, a critical industrial corridor. Convenience stores and businesses went up in flames. Michoacán, the avocado-producing heartland that generates billions in exports, saw highways blocked and vehicles destroyed. These are not random targets. Each location represents a piece of territory that someone is fighting to control. The ports on the Pacific coast serve as entry points for precursor chemicals used to manufacture synthetic drugs. The highways connecting industrial centers to the United States border are worth billions to whoever controls them. The agricultural regions provide both cover and revenue. What makes this conflict particularly dangerous is the power vacuum created when a leader falls. The Sinaloa cartel, Cartel del Norte, and dozens of smaller organizations are all watching, waiting to see if CJNG will fracture or fight back harder. In Mexico's cartel wars. Chaos is not just a byproduct of violence, it is a strategy. When Mexican forces finally cornered El Mencho in a wooded hideout near the mountain town of Tapalpa, it marked the end of a manhunt that had spanned years and tested the limits of Mexico's security strategy. The operation itself read like something from a Hollywood thriller. Military helicopters encircled a remote cabin. Gunfire erupted. A helicopter was forced into an emergency landing, echoing a failed 2015 raid, when cartel gunmen actually shot down a chopper with a rocket-propelled grenade. This time, though, the outcome was different. El Mencho fled into the forest wounded, and captured he died while being transported for medical treatment. But here is where the story takes a darker turn. The cartel's response was immediate and devastating. Almost 100 major roads were blocked across western Mexico, vehicles were torched, supermarkets were vandalized, 25 members of the National Guard were killed in the retaliatory violence, 34 gunmen died, schools closed, airlines suspended flights. President Claudia Sheinbaum declared Mexico at peace just days later, but the charred buses and burned-out cars lining streets from Jalisco to Michoacán told a different story. This is the brutal reality that has haunted Mexico's approach to cartel leadership for years. Even success comes at an enormous cost. The question that has haunted policymakers from Andrés Manuel López Obrador's hugs, not bullets, philosophy, through to the current administration, is whether any strategy can truly break this cycle. Decapitating cartels sounds effective in theory. In practice, it often unleashes chaos that ordinary Mexicans pay for with their lives. The human cost of Mexico's cartel crisis is almost impossible to fully comprehend when Mexican forces finally caught up with El Mencho in that mountain town of Tapalpa. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Within hours, burning vehicles blocked roads at more than 250 points across 20 Mexican states. Guadalajara, a city of millions, turned into a ghost town as ordinary people hid in their homes, schools closed, businesses shuttered. 7 National Guard troops lost their lives in the violence that followed. But this is just one moment in a much larger tragedy. For years, communities across Jalisco and beyond have lived under the shadow of CJNG. Extortion payments become just another cost of doing business. Disappearances leave families searching for loved ones who may never be found. Entire towns have been emptied as cartels fight for territory. And then there is the fentanyl, the synthetic opioid that CJNG has pumped across the border, has torn through American communities like nothing before it. Tens of thousands of deaths each year, families shattered, all traced back to laboratories in the mountains of Jalisco. So what happens now that El Mencho is gone? History offers some troubling possibilities. When previous cartel leaders fell, their organizations often fractured into warring factions. Violence spiked as lieutenants fought for control. Some analysts predict the same fate for CJNG, others point to El Mencho's son as a potential successor. Though he lacks his father's mystique and connections, the Mexican government under President Claudia Sheinbaum has signaled a tougher stance, working more closely with American intelligence than ever before. But whether this moment represents the beginning of the end for CJNG, or simply the start of an even bloodier chapter, remains an open question for the people living in cartel territory. Hope and fear exist in equal measure.